I moved into the house on Larkspur Court in Millbrook, Ohio in April of last year, mostly because it was the only place in a decent school district my wife and I could afford after 2 years of losing bidding wars. It was a modest three-bedroom ranch built in 1974 with a big backyard that the previous owners had clearly neglected. Overgrown grass, a rotted wooden shed leaning at a concerning angle, and a section near the back fence where nothing grew at all. Just a flat, bare patch of hard-packed dirt about 8 feet by 10 feet. I want to tell the story in order, because the order is the only reason any of it makes sense, and because for the first 3 weeks, none of it seemed strange at all. It just seemed like I had an odd neighbor. Every neighborhood has one. His name was Gerald Rossum. He was somewhere in his early 70s, lived alone in the house directly behind ours. Our backyards shared a fence line, an old chain-link fence with gaps in it big enough that our dog, Biscuit, a 60-pound lab mix, could technically squeeze through if she really wanted to, which she occasionally did. Gerald had lived there, according to the woman 2 doors down who'd lived on the street since the Clinton administration, for almost 40 years. His wife had died a decade earlier. He kept to himself. He was, by all accounts, a little intense but harmless, which is a sentence I would come to think about a lot in the months that followed. The first interaction I had with him was over the fence, about 2 weeks after we moved in, when I was out clearing the overgrown yard with a weed whacker. He came out onto his back porch. I hadn't even realized anyone was home, and just stood there watching me for a solid minute before he called out, "You planning on doing much more back there?" I said I figured I'd clear the whole yard eventually, maybe put in a vegetable garden, redo the shed, normal new homeowner stuff. He nodded slowly, said, "All right then," and went back inside. I thought nothing of it. The bare patch of dirt near the fence line, though, kept nagging at me. Nothing grew there, not even weeds, which in that yard was saying something, because weeds grew everywhere else with genuine enthusiasm. My wife, Danielle, joked that maybe a previous owner had poured something toxic there, oil or antifreeze, and killed the soil. I figured I'd dig it up, add some topsoil and compost, and see if I could get grass to take. That's when things got strange. I went out on a Saturday morning in early May with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, planning to turn over that dead patch of dirt. I'd been at it maybe 20 minutes, just surface work, breaking up the hard-packed top few inches, when I heard the back door of Gerald's house slam open so hard I heard it from my own yard. He came across his lawn toward the shared fence line almost at a jog, which surprised me because up to that point I'd only ever seen him move like a man conserving energy for a longer life. He got to the fence, gripped the chain link with both hands, and said in a voice that had a tremor in it I initially mistook for anger, "What are you doing?" I told him I was just turning over some dead soil, trying to get grass to grow. "Don't dig there. Just leave that patch alone, please." I asked him why. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the patch of dirt for a long moment, and then he said something that I wrote down in the notes app on my phone that same afternoon because I knew, even then, that I wasn't going to remember it accurately later without doing that. "Some things are better left settled. That ground settled. Leave it settled." I told him, reasonably I thought, that it was my yard and I appreciated his concern, but I was planning to landscape the whole back section eventually. He said, "I understand it's your yard. I'm asking you as a neighbor. Please, don't dig there." And then he walked back to his house without waiting for a response. Danielle thought it was funny at first. We joked about it. Maybe he'd buried a dog back there decades ago and didn't want us disturbing the grave. Maybe there was some old property dispute about the fence line. Maybe he was just a genuinely eccentric old man who'd fixated on a random patch of dirt for reasons that made sense only to him. We let it go for a while. I worked on other parts of the yard, the shed, the side beds, the fence on the opposite side of the property, and mostly forgot about the dead patch. But Gerald didn't forget about it. Over the next month, I noticed him watching our yard more than what felt normal. I'd see him on his back porch in the evenings, not doing anything, just sitting, angled so he had a clear sight line to that section of our yard. Twice, I saw him out there after dark with a flashlight, walking along his side of the fence line, shining the light into our yard. The second time that happened, it was maybe 11 at night and I was up because Biscuit had woken me needing to go out. I saw the flashlight being sweep across a dead patch, linger there for a solid second afterward, and then click off. I stood at my back door for a solid minute afterward, feeling a specific kind of unease that I don't think I'd felt since I was a kid convinced something was under my bed. I mentioned it to Danielle. She said maybe we should just ask him directly what was going on, adult to adult, instead of speculating. I tried. I went over one Sunday afternoon with a six-pack, the Universal Midwestern Peace Offering, and knocked on his door. He answered, seemed surprised, and let me stand on his porch, didn't invite me in, while we made small talk about the neighborhood for a few minutes. I eventually brought it up as casually as I could. Hey, I don't want this to be weird, but I notice you seem concerned about that back corner of my yard. Is there something I should know about? Old property line issue, something buried, anything like that? He got very quiet, took the six-pack, thanked me for it, and said it's nothing you need to worry about, just an old man's habits. My wife used to keep a garden there, back when the fence was different. I don't like seeing it disturbed. Sentimental is all. That explanation actually worked on me for a few weeks. It was plausible. Grief does strange things to people, makes them protective of odd, specific things. I decided to just avoid that particular patch of yard out of basic decency and move on with my life. Then in late June, something happened that made the sentimental garden explanation fall apart completely. Biscuit got out through a gap in the fence one evening, not an unusual occurrence, and I went out to retrieve her, apologizing to Gerald over the fence as I usually did when this happened. But this time, Biscuit wasn't in Gerald's yard. She was digging, fast and frantic at a spot along his side of the fence line, almost directly across from our dead patch, whining in a way I'd never heard her whine before. Not playful, not anxious about being scolded, but a low, urgent distress sound. Gerald came out of his house so fast I genuinely thought he was going to have a heart attack doing it. He grabbed a rake that was leaning against his back steps and started trying to physically herd Biscuit away from the spot, swinging the rake near Biscuit, not making contact but close enough that I yelled at him to stop and ran over the fence gap myself to grab my dog. I got Biscuit and pulled her back, and in the process of doing that, I looked down at the spot she'd been digging. There was maybe 4 inches of exposed dirt where she'd scratched through the grass, and in that 4 inches, I could see the edge of something dark blue, a tarp or a thick plastic sheet buried maybe 6 inches under the surface. Gerald saw me looking at it. His face did something I still think about. It wasn't anger. It was a kind of collapsing, like a man watching a wall he'd been holding up finally give way. He said, "Please, just fill that back in and go inside. I'm begging you." I did not fill it back in and go inside. I want to be honest that in the moment, I was scared, genuinely physically scared, in a way that felt very different from garden variety neighbor awkwardness. I took Biscuit inside, told Danielle what I'd seen, and we had a genuinely difficult conversation about what to do next. Danielle's position was that we should call the police immediately. My position, which I'm less proud of in hindsight, was that we should wait, maybe try to talk to Gerald again, because calling the cops on a 70-something-year-old widower over a buried tarp felt like a massive overreaction that could destroy a man's reputation over what might turn out to be, I don't know, an old carpet, a dead pet, literally anything innocent. We ended up compromising. I called the non-emergency police line that same night and explained the situation calmly, factually, without speculation. A patrol officer came out about 90 minutes later, took a report, looked at the exposed corner of tarp with a flashlight, and told us that without more information, they couldn't do anything that night, but that he was noting the report and would flag it for a follow-up. The follow-up happened 4 days later. And it happened because Gerald apparently could not stand the waiting any more than we could. Danielle told me later that around 6 a.m. she woke up to the sound of digging outside, real digging, frantic, right at the fence line. She looked out the bedroom window and saw Gerald in his yard, in pajama pants and an undershirt, on his knees, pulling at the corner of that tarp with his bare hands, trying to unbury and rebury something before daylight fully broke. She called 911 immediately. I was already awake by the time two patrol cars arrived, and I watched from my back window as two officers approached Gerald, who by that point was sitting on the ground next to a half-exposed section of tarp, not resisting, not running, just sitting there with dirt on his hands, looking from a distance like every ounce of fight had gone out of him at once. What was under that tarp was not a body. I want to get that out of the way immediately because I know where your mind is going, because it's where mine went too. It was not a body. It was roughly $340,000 in cash, sealed in vacuum-packed bags inside two military surplus ammo cans, along with a handwritten ledger, a stack of old photographs, and, this is the detail that ended up mattering most, a small fireproof lockbox containing what turned out to be physical evidence connected to an unsolved 1987 armored car robbery in Dayton, about 90 minutes from Millbrook. Gerald Rossum, it turned out, had been one of four men involved in that robbery 37 years earlier. He'd never been arrested. The case had gone cold for decades. But according to what came out over the following months through court filings and eventually a genuinely surreal true crime podcast episode that Danielle made me listen to, Gerald had been the getaway driver, a role small enough that he'd never been a serious suspect, but guilty enough that he'd spent nearly 36 decades living 20 minutes from the scene of the crime with his share of the money buried in his own backyard, too afraid to spend it and too guilty to turn himself in. Two of the other three men involved had died, one in a car accident in the 90s, one of natural causes in 2015. The fourth, according to the investigation that followed, had apparently threatened Gerald decades earlier that if any of the money ever surfaced or if Gerald ever talked, he would make sure Gerald paid for all of them. That man, it turned out, was still alive, still local, and had, this came out during Gerald's eventual interviews with detectives, driven past Gerald's house twice in the preceding 2 years, which was, according to Gerald's own statement, the reason he'd become so obsessively protective of that patch of ground the moment new neighbors started digging near it. He wasn't worried about us finding a body. He was worried the wrong person would notice the ground had been disturbed and realize the money hadn't been dealt with, and come looking for either the cash or Gerald himself. Gerald was arrested and charged decades later with armed robbery and accessory-related charges connected to the 1987 armored car robbery. Because of his age, his lack of any other criminal history in the intervening 37 years, and the plea agreement that involved him providing detailed information implicating the surviving fourth man, who was arrested about 6 weeks later in Kentucky, Gerald ultimately received a reduced sentence. Last I heard, through the neighborhood grapevine and one very awkward follow-up conversation with a detective who came by to ask if we'd noticed anything else unusual over the prior year, he was looking at somewhere between 4 and 7 years, likely to be served, given his age and health, in a medical designated facility. Danielle and I ended up landscaping that whole back section of yard ourselves months later, once the investigation was fully closed and we were legally cleared to do so. We put in raised garden beds, tomatoes mostly, and some flowers Danielle picked because she said the yard needed something that wasn't grim after everything. Gerald's house sold about 8 months after his arrest to a young couple with a toddler who has since become good friends with our own kid. Neither of them has any idea what happened in that backyard before they moved in, and I've gone back and forth more than I can count about whether that's information they deserve to have or a kindness to withhold. So far, I've withheld it. The thing I keep coming back to, honestly, isn't the money, the robbery, or even the arrest. It's the image of Gerald on his knees at 6 in the morning, digging with his bare hands, trying to fix in 20 minutes what he'd let sit wrong for 37. Like you'd frantically try to undo something the second it's too late, even though some part of you has known for decades that it already was. I think about that a lot more than I think about the money.